You know, doing the show has been a rare opportunity for me to go back and pay a little closer attention to stuff that I otherwise would have ignored. I like to think that it's helped me uncover a lot of new insights. You know, it's given me a little more of a fresh perspective on the music that I grew up with. Well, I'm sick of doing all that. It's time for me to start talking about music I actually care about for a change. In a new segment I like to call Jacob Gets Lazy. Unrest were one of the cornerstones of 90s indie rock. They started back in the early 80s in Washington, D.C. Frontman Mark Robinson started his own record label called Teen Beat back then, when he was in high school. The band was kind of a scruffy, lo-fi post-punk band when they started off, almost literally just releasing their home recordings, just jamming around with whatever they could think of. The early albums are very scattershot for this reason. A lot of it seems a little tongue-in-cheek. They kind of hop genres willy-nilly. A lot of it comes off like pastiche more than homage half the time. But it's all born out of this really deep affection for a really quite nerdy set of interests. You have references to obscure artists and musicians in the DC area such as Isabel Bishop, Kath Carroll, Butch Willis, Kenneth Anger. And the first album they released during the 90s was called Custom Carnal Blaxploitation. And it's about as inexplicable as that title suggests. See, towards the late 80s and early 90s, there was a certain form of heavy metal-inspired sludge rock. I don't know, some people called it grunge, like that's gonna go anywhere. It was the main sound of bands like Melvins, Killdozer, Nirvana, Tad, and a lot of this album comes off like Unrest's attempt at paying homage to those styles. But typically they're also all over the place as well. There's weird funk tracks. Actual hard-on-sleeve acoustic folk love songs. She makes me shake, she makes me shake. And the kind of wild experimentation that you would find on independent releases from this time period. A few characteristics I would use to describe Mark Robinson's sensibility and approach to making music are a sense of playfulness and never really taking himself too seriously, while at the same time still being artistically ambitious and still trying to tie together as many of his obsessions as possible into a singular sound and to carve out his band's identity based on all of these disparate elements that don't really belong together. But simply because of one person's vision, they kind of work. I would say Unrest's greatest contribution was their ability to run with the indie rock post-punk sensibility while still embracing more overtly pop sounds and styles. A lot of their music is just ridiculous and contained homages and references to things that you wouldn't really imagine working that well within the context of indie rock music, but they made it work. Like their song Teenage Suicide from Custom Carnal Blaxploitation. Teenage suicide, don't do it. Teenage suicide, yes I can. Basically takes a little snippet of music found in the movie Heathers and fleshes it out into an entire song. And it's kind of silly, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but you can tell that they actually really mean it. There is a sort of innocence to it. There is, you know, they do sing about more mature subject matter at times, but it always comes across as kind of wholesome, I guess, is the best way I can put it. Most of all, even though they were always trying to be as entertaining as possible, I think sometimes to their detriment, you know, they were also legitimately experimental. But they never forgot to be fun. They were a band that presented their artistic side of themselves to their audience while trying to keep things as fun and entertaining as possible. And that is something I find commendable. A lot of the criticisms you hear about experimental music of this period is that it tends to be a little boring, and it tends to be a little dry and drab. You couldn't say that about Unrest's music, even when it went overboard into excessive experimentation and just kind of noodled around seemingly without much in the way of a real point. They still managed to make their style quite enjoyable for their fans. But Unrest finally settled on something approximating a clear identity in 1992's Imperial FFRR. And this is the album that really put Unrest on the map nationwide. The emphasis here is almost on a joyful celebration of rock music. What you have here is them playing a lot of really jangly, clean guitar chords on constant 16th note strumming on some tracks. tracks slow things down almost to the point of being dream pop. You have your acoustic numbers, you have your instrumental, sort of noisy numbers.
Isabel, Isabel, Isabel.
But it all hangs together as a unified statement much better than any of their previous releases, thanks to a new emphasis on sonic beauty and a naive sense of childlike wonder and joy. Crucially, this is the album where they were joined by new member Bridget Cross on bass and vocals. She brought sort of a newer dimension to the band's sound that they could not create prior to that.
They took the heart right out of you.
Certain hallmarks of their style remain from the earlier records. The lyrics still read like clipped sentence fragments more than anything else. And there are still moments that seem a little sillier or a little more tongue-in-cheek, but I think there's also a higher degree of sincerity here than on any of their previous records. And really, even the throwaway instrumental filler tracks are worth sitting through in this case. For me, most albums aren't much more than the sum of the highlights as far as the best songs on it go, but this is one of those cases where the entire album I think is worth sitting through as a whole, and the parts that would seem weak out of their context actually work better within the context of the album. In 1994, they released their follow-up album, Perfect Teeth. This one had a little more songwriting input from Bridget on it, and there's a lot more of her contributions on vocals, doing a little bit more harmonizing with Mark than there was before.
Angel, I will walk you.
It's a little bit more of a straight-ahead musical album, I guess, is the best way to put it, for lack of a better term. It really feels like Unrest has figured themselves out, and they're trying as best as they can to deliver the best collection of songs that they can produce at this point. And there's just a greater degree of maturity and musicianship than on any of their previous albums. While I do prefer Imperial FFRR, I do think that this album probably has more good songs on it than that album does. I don't know. It doesn't make that much sense, but neither did anything that they did, really. The band broke up soon after that, after drummer Phil Krauth left. He was the only original member of the band other than Mark. And so then Mark and Bridget formed a band called Air Miami, and they released an album called Me, 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 which is just as good as anything that they did as together as Unrest.
That night when I was right about this kiss for you.
I would definitely recommend checking that album out if you like anything that you hear previously in this video. And Mark Robinson has just gone on producing music in other bands and solo on his own label. You know, you have that kind of freedom when you have your own label. Unrest has reformed as well in the 2010s. Teen Beat has reissued their albums more recently, so they should be a lot easier to find than they used to be. That stuff was out of print for a while, but there are updated editions you can look for if you want to hear more. Unrest were a celebration of the do-it-yourself spirit of 90s independent rock. I do wish they would have lasted a little bit longer into the 90s, but I think they did enough that people who heard them definitely took what they did and went a little further with it. Some of them even probably went a little more mainstream with it. And so I think they still deserve to be heard to this day. Until next time, I am Jacob. This was Rad 90s Music. I'll see you sometime in the future.